Hey folks, I'm back. Reflections on the Road. Yes, I really like that name, by the way. So now we're going to talk about 3 evidence-based strategies or practices you can use in your classroom to help your students learn more effectively. It's actually the topic Hall Houston from the University of Taipei in Taiwan and this guy here discussed in the latest issue of MindBrainEd Think Tank. So you can access, I'm pretty sure I've posted it everywhere on social media, but if you haven't seen it, just go to MindBrainEd Think Tank, okay? So we talk about a couple of strategies that have something to do with forgetting, right? And how important forgetting is for memory to be consolidated, which sounds like a paradox, but it's actually how it works. When we are first exposed to something, to new knowledge, to new information, we have to consolidate that so that we can retrieve later on and use it whenever we have to use it. But the thing is, we also have to forget, so we have to stop thinking about it so that we can start consolidating. Because if we keep focusing on that, so it's kind of like in the memory, in the working memory system, and it doesn't consolidate, it doesn't get, let's say, connected to the rest of your neural networks in the other parts of the cortex, right? The brain cortex. So, which are these very nice, incredibly useful, I'd say, 3 strategies for you to help your students remember things and learn things, okay? It's not just about remembering, it's really about learning long term, okay? Because remembering and learning are not the same thing necessarily, right? Okay, dangerous, there's a truck here, so let me take it. Okay, so first thing you can do, and I think this is very useful really, it's called retrieval practice. So retrieval practice means that once you've been exposed to something, so let's say in this particular lesson, your teacher talked about new vocabulary or a new grammar structure. After a couple of minutes, you tend to forget those things, right? So one of the things you can do to strengthen the neural network for you to start consolidating that as memory, right, is for you to retrieve. And retrieving means trying to remember what you've been exposed to. So let's say we're working with present continuous, for example, for the very first time, basic level. And then after you did a couple of things, activities, you know, so you could take a break and then you ask your students, so what have we been talking about? What were we talking about, right? Can you remember what we discussed? And then they will go like, oh yes. Can you think of some examples? So they're retrieving, right? The other way you can work with retrieving is at the beginning of the following class. So you can ask students to retrieve what they worked with, right, in the previous lesson, because that's actually going to activate their prior knowledge. And this is really, you know, essential if we want to build more knowledge there. One way you can do that is like a brain dump. So you get a Post-it, for example, piece of paper, and just write down everything you can remember from last class, right? Or the previous activity if it's about the same class, right? And this is very interesting. This is something you can do every class, basically, right? It works. The other thing you can do, the other strategy actually, is interleaving. So interleaving, and again, remember I talked about Robert Bjork's desirable difficulties. They are part of that, the desirable difficulties by Robert Bjork, okay? So how do we interleave? So for your students to study at home, let's say, and they have many subjects to study, normally what they do is that they study the same subject for hours and hours for a test or whatever. And apparently, the evidence suggests that it's better if they study a block, let's say, of a couple of minutes. They study this subject and then the other subject and then another subject and then go back to the first one, right? And those blocks, I think they can be based on the idea of the Pomodoro technique, right? So you get a Pomodoro timer and you study for a 25-minute block, and then you take a 5-minute break, and then you go back to studying, but then you change the subject. So if you studied math for 25 minutes, take a 5-minute break and then study English, take a 5-minute break and then history, and then go back to math, for example, which is better than if you study math for an hour and a half and then you move on to English and history. That works well. How can you do it in your lesson when you're teaching? Well, I tend to use brain breaks, and I think brain breaks are awesome. So every now and then, normally between 15 and 25 minutes, so I try to stick to the Pomodoro technique, right? I will give a break, and then we're gonna go back to something else. So we can have a break after the first 20 minutes or 25 minutes. And then in the next block, we're not going to discuss what we were discussing necessarily. We can actually revisit a couple of things we did before, like one lesson before, or maybe even 5 lessons before. Because then we're doing something else, the third strategy, which is spacing. And I've talked about this here. It's spaced repetition, right? So what you're doing basically, you're helping your students revisit or revise certain content, different types of content within a certain frequency, right? Because normally it takes, again, it depends on many factors, of course, but normally it takes time for learning to be consolidated in the brain, because we have to keep going back to and retrieving that information, right? So one way we can do that, we can help our students do that, we can set up a spaced repetition schedule, for example. And the rule of thumb is, if you studied today and you got input in the classroom today, so you should study again tomorrow, but don't simply reread your notes. That doesn't work very well. So tomorrow you retrieve, right? Tomorrow, when you wake up, you try to remember, okay, what was it that we studied yesterday? What was the topic of the lesson? And then you write down everything like a brain dump, and then you compare to your notes, and you will see that you were able to remember certain things, other things you were not able to remember, which means that you can focus on re-studying or rereading, let's say, the things you were not able to remember. Because chances are you need to spend more time working on those things because you could not remember them. So that's the next day, the following day after the input, right? And then you can do like 3 days after. And then how about 6 days after, right? And then 12 days after, yeah? Catch my drift, right? So that's the idea. So it's like an exponential equation. Again, it's a rule of thumb. It's really hard for me to tell you, for anybody to tell you what's the best space, let's say, between the last time you revise something and the next time you should do it, because it depends on many variables, like I said. It depends on your prior knowledge, your emotional state, the cognitive load of the topic, the content, so many things, right? So, but if you do use that, if you create a spaced repetition schedule, if you ask your students to interleave, or if you set up your lesson in a way that they're going to have a break every 25 minutes, and then they're going to work on something different, they're interleaving. And it doesn't really have to be different content, but in a different way, really. And retrieving, so instead of just having them reread their stuff, their notes, ask them to try to remember, and even stuff from many classes ago, because then you're working with spaced repetition. I'm sure you're going to help your students improve their learning outcomes, okay? So that's from the science of learning, all right? That's it, folks. If you want to know more, there are many wonderful tips on Jolt. the Japanese Association of Language Teachers, I guess, they are the ones responsible for the MindBrainEd Think Tank, okay? So remember, we wrote that, Hall Houston and I, and you have a bunch of tips there that are going to be really useful if you want your students to be able to remember things better and learn things better, okay? All right, see you when I see you.